It's hard
several hundred.
to express or to give dimension. Here in the United States, we're used to some level of freedom of information and going around and doing our reporting. It's hard to explain how difficult was to actually do journalism in those years, in the years of the Chilean coup, but also the Argentine coup, at a time when Latin America was immersed in this right-wing dictatorships. Like Marcela or John, would you want to tell us a little bit what was it like to do journalism at the time?
Well, John was working at that time. You were founder of the APSI magazine, right?
Yes.
And I think that was one of the most successful projects of the media against the dictatorship. But many others were silenced. The journalists were persecuted and killed by the regime. I think it was a very risky, dangerous job at that time.
Well, no, I can tell you my experience. I was here for the first 5 years, and we created OPSI with great restrictions. It was permitted by the government on the condition that we only wrote about international affairs.
Yeah.
So it was called Actualidad Internacional,
Yeah.
International reality. So we would write about Brazil and the human rights movement in Brazil. We would write about the Jimmy Carter election in 1976, and then when he took power in 1977, and his human rights policy which was incredibly important for Latin America. We would write about those topics, but we couldn't write directly about Chile for the first 2 or 3 years. But I was able to publish, however, outside of Chile because I worked for the Washington Post and Time magazine. So many of the stories, for example, I wrote, I think, the first story documenting the phenomenon of the disappeared, the phenomenon which is a deliberate tactic of capturing people, putting them in secret prisons, executing them after torture, and then hiding their bodies, o sea, making them disappear. That tactic, that intentional tactic of killing people secretly, is what we call the tactic of disappearance, forced disappearance. And we didn't understand it at the time. The people in the human rights community didn't know what was going on. They thought that these people would eventually appear because no bodies were appearing. And sadly, during 1976, which I was able to publish in the Washington Post, evidence that was given to me by the human rights organization, the Vicaría de Solidaridad, and the Committee for Peace, that this was deliberate, that there were 5 cycles of disappearances, each of which had 30 or 40 people who had been captured and disappeared. And these people were never going to appear again. And that was the beginning of the understanding of this horrible tactic of disappearance. So that was one of my articles. I was able to write that because I traveled to Washington and I wrote the story in Washington. It never appeared in the Chilean press, as far as I can tell. But other articles that were not as sensitive that I wrote in the Washington Post, they would then be repeated in a small column called Chile Abroad, Chile en el Exterior, which El Mercurio would publish in this little column small summaries of articles that had appeared in the international press about Chile. So sometimes very important cases of human rights violations. They were able to publish them because they'd already been published abroad, but they wouldn't ever do the republishing. They wouldn't do the reporting themselves. So often sometimes the journalists would give me the details. So I would, so I would publish it in the Washington Post, and then it would appear in Chile in what they called the rebote, the bounce back.
I would like to add two comments about this. One is that for people like me, I was born in 1971, so I was 1 year old at the moment of the coup. I grew up without information about these crimes. All the information that we had were rumors about people that was missing, for example, but nobody was sure that they were killed, for example. And it was very difficult to obtain information for us. People shared, as John has said, people share some articles from foreign media, but not Chilean media. And there were some projects, very brave projects, like APSI, and also other magazines like Cause, Analysis, and others. And also there was a TV media project that was called Teleanalysis. And they elaborate a news program, a news report about the protests that start happening in Chile during the 80s, 1983.
1983.
Yes, and they cover all these protests. They elaborate a program, and they tape it in a videotape, so we could see these videotapes in our homes, in our machines, VHS machines, but not in the open media, not on television. And I think this little windows to the truth were very important for us to understand the magnitude of the situation in Chile.